So, Earth's early history. Earth wasn't always as cute as it is now. It wasn't always blue. The sky wasn't always blue. There wasn't always a ground for us to walk on. So, what they believe that the Earth basically looked like before, there were a lot of asteroids and meteors just slamming into the Earth, big giant rocks just floating around that decided, you know what, we should just slam into the Earth. They all did it till eventually the globe as a whole melted. Then you had volcanic activity with thunderstorms. It was a nightmare. Eventually, though, the Earth managed to cool down to allow the rock to solidify. Then you got water condensation, which ended up with rain, and it started to stabilize into what it is today. So, just to show you guys what it looked like, Earth basically looked like it was a nightmare. Now, like I said, the sky wasn't always nice, cute, and blue, and now it's basically because the atmosphere gases weren't what they are today. There was no oxygen. There was carbon dioxide, water vapor, nitrogen, some carbon monoxide, not too much, hydrogen sulfide, and hydrogen cyanide. Remember, this is all a hypothesis. We cannot really prove this, but this is what we believe based on evidence that we've seen that we think the Earth was made out of, especially the atmospheres. So because of all these gases, the sky was pinkish orange, and eventually, because iron eventually dissolved at the bottom of the ocean, it did turn blue, but at that time, once they finally got the oceans going, they were brown. So you're going to have these two main scientists that we're going to be talking about today. You have Stanley Miller and Harold Urey. So before we even get to talking about them at all, before Darwin came along and suggested natural selection, basically the evolution of organisms to what they are today, many people believed in this thing called spontaneous generation. So basically that means if I were to just like leave a cookie out of nowhere, just like a cat would appear and eat my cookie. For what reason, I don't know, but that's what they thought because they couldn't see the microorganisms. Now, because we know better, these two scientists decided, well, we couldn't have just spawned out of nowhere. We had to come from somewhere. So what they did was they set up this contraption here, and they tried to recreate the Earth's early atmosphere. So you had the water heating for the water vapor to form. This is basically what it's going to represent. Then as it goes up the tubes, because of the pressure built up by the actual heating of the water, it mixes up with the methane, ammonia, and hydrogen. Then it comes over here where you have these sparks, which basically create electricity, which are there to kind of signify the thunderstorms that were happening. Then you have the condenser chamber, which basically cools the water down. Just like I said, eventually the Earth did cool, and that allowed the Earth's everything to happen. The water managed to become introduced, you had the condensation. So what they did is they kind of left it running. And then after a week, they took the liquid. Now it wasn't blue anymore. It was brown. It was nasty. And then once they actually tested the liquid, they found that it had amino acids and organic compounds, which is basically the whole purpose of the RNA World Hypothesis. Now, when we're talking about the RNA World Hypothesis, not theory, hypothesis, we're basically just saying, let me see if I can go to the slide, that eventually as the Earth cooled and started becoming more like what we know today, you have organic matters that become simple organic molecules, which eventually led to RNA nucleotides. Then some form of RNA that started to stabilize itself and basically bend itself into different things that then led to proteins, RNA, and eventually DNA. Now, we talked about how the gases in the atmosphere aren't what they are today. So in the lack of presence of oxygen, it then makes sense that if the early prokaryotes were around in a place where there was no oxygen, when we look at these organisms are not actually reliant on oxygen. So if they were around today with the presence of oxygen, it may actually have reacted negatively, almost like a poison to them because they're not used to it. Then eventually, once that happened, you had those prokaryotes that didn't need oxygen. We ended up with photosynthetic bacteria. Now again, they don't need oxygen to survive, but they are leaving oxygen in the atmosphere as a byproduct. So they're spewing out oxygen. This is the first time we're going to see it, especially in this little timeline we set up for you guys. So eventually, oxygen and the iron in the oceans started to produce iron oxide or rust. Iron oxide, which is not soluble in water, would then sink to the bottom of the ocean, and then that started to basically give the water the blue-green color that we see today. Now, think about that happening for a long time. Eventually, the oxygen is going to accumulate in the atmosphere. The ozone layer then begins to form. Now the sky is blue. It's not that pink, orange color. Then eventually the oxygen levels rise to the level that we are comfortable with now today. So many scientists think that Earth's early atmosphere may have been similar to the gases released by volcanoes today. So this is the composition of Earth's atmosphere today and the gases from the volcano, just to give you guys some ideas. So if we think that this is what it was like before, just look at the difference. A lot of organisms now still don't really need oxygen. There are different pathways that even you can take, not for a long time, but there are ways to live without oxygen. Origin of eukaryotic cells. So for this specific part, we're going to talk about the endosymbiotic theory. Basically, it's like two prokaryotic cells kind of just chilling together. Then one of them gets hungry, turns to his friend and says, "You look good," and he ate him. And that's basically what it is. You have an ancient prokaryotic cell kind of chilling with another bacteria, and it swallowed it. And eventually, as it developed, it just kind of developed with that information already inside. And it can go one of two ways. Either it also ate another photosynthetic bacteria, which would be the chloroplast today, or it just ate that one weird bacteria, which is the mitochondria. That's how people believe that we got chloroplast and the mitochondria into the cells. The why is because the mitochondria and the chloroplast have their own DNA. They can basically live on their own, not as they are now, but in that old time. In theory, they should be able to live by themselves. They have energy that they provide for themselves. They have their own set of DNA. They could be their own cell, basically. Because if it's evolved in the cell, now not so much, but in theory, it makes sense that it would have been its own original thing. Now, this was proposed more than a century ago, and it's just basically going to talk about what I said now. Let's see. Chloroplast has its own bacterial DNA. This is everything I've just mentioned. Development of sexual reproduction sped up the evolutionary change because sexual reproduction increases genetic variation. We're going to get to this more when we actually go over meiosis. Basically, asexual reproduction gives you a clone. Sexual reproduction allows for the shift in genes in many kinds of ways, and that eventually can lead to different kinds of mutations, different gene variations, and all of this basically allows for a better and faster change in the population. And we're done.